Hello, and a very warm welcome. My name is Michael Edmonstone, and I'm the Communications and Engagement Lead here at Shoal. Today is World Wetlands Day, a chance to recognize and celebrate those most remarkable and undervalued ecosystems, wetlands. I'm sure the audience here will need no introduction to the ecological power of wetlands. They're among the most productive and life-sustaining ecosystems on Earth. As biodiversity hotspots, they support an incredible variety of species. They improve water quality and regulate freshwater supplies. They're natural defenders against floods and droughts, and they play a crucial role in the fight against climate change. Despite their immense value, we have lost and degraded almost 90% of the world's wetlands since the 1700s, and they continue to disappear at a rate faster than forests. This year's World Wetlands Day theme is Wetlands and Traditional Knowledge, Celebrating Cultural Heritage. The topic invites us to look beyond the science and the ecosystem functions and to honor the deep, enduring relationships between wetlands and human culture. We're extremely fortunate to be joined by some wonderful panelists who are truly experts on this topic. First up, we'll have Phoebe Griffith, postdoctoral researcher at the Leibniz Institute of Freshwater Ecology and Inland Fisheries in Berlin. Phoebe researches the conservation of freshwater megafauna, and her work focuses on conserving the biocultural diversity of life in freshwater ecosystems. She's a global expert on the cultural significance of freshwater fishes and crocodilians. She's also a National Geographic explorer and a senior research fellow at the Himalayan Nature, Nepal. Phoebe's presentation is called Bigger Fish to Fry, Biocultural Diversity and the Conservation of Freshwater Fishes. Next up will be Alexander Barty, the communications consultant at the Sustainable Eel Group. Alexander studied English and architectural history at Exeter, UCL, and Oxford, and worked in communications roles at Rodrich, Davidson Architects, London, and KOP Properties, Singapore, before returning to education full-time to undertake a PhD in English literature. He joined the Sustainable Eel Group in 2020 and was recently a researcher and delegate at the CITES Conference of the Parties in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. His ongoing UKRI-funded research considers the impact of Victorian water engineering solutions on European eel stocks, employing literary criticism as a primary research method. Alexander is a true global authority on the traditional and historical significance of eels. His presentation today is entitled Gothic Ecologies, the European Eel in the Victorian Cultural Imagination. And last but definitely not least will be Eden Skipper, Environmental Advisor at Wairewa, Rūnanga, a Maori tribal council who act as guardians for the lake and its surroundings, supporting the people and the environment around Te Roto o Waihora on the Banks Peninsula near Christchurch, New Zealand. His tribal affiliations are Ngai Tahu. Eden's talk today is entitled, If the Tuna are Healthy, If the Lake is Healthy, the People are Healthy. A very small bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar will last approximately an hour and a half. Phoebe, Alexander, and Eden will all present, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. Georgie will be moderating the chat, so please keep your questions coming in throughout the talks. The session is being recorded and we'll upload it to Shoal's YouTube channel and website. So if you would like to rewatch, or if you know of anybody who was hoping to watch but couldn't quite make it, you'll be able to find it online from tomorrow at youtube.com/Shoal_org, or go to the Shoal website, shoalconservation.org, click on the news and stories section and then videos. That should be everything from me. I've spoken enough. Phoebe, if you're ready, it's over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I will share this and hopefully the presentation is now visible. Okay, let's go. So yes, as has already been introduced, the biodiversity of wetlands the world over is really exceptional. And freshwaters are remarkably biodiverse, considering that they're just 1% of the Earth's surface. They contain a staggering number of all known species, but perhaps what is most mind-boggling is 50% of known fish species are actually found in freshwater, despite them being this really small amount of the available watery ecosystems of the Earth. But alongside this massive biodiversity, there is an incredible associated human cultural diversity in terms of our relationships with these fishes. There are multitudes of different culturally shaped relationships found the world over in every culture, in every ecosystem. And sometimes a single species of fish in a single river basin may have an insanely huge amount of cultural diversity associated with it. So, this way of thinking about biological and cultural diversity together is this concept of biocultural diversity. And so, biocultural diversity comprises the diversity of life in all its manifestations, biological, cultural, and linguistic, which are interrelated and likely co-evolved within a complex socio-ecological adaptive system. So two parts of that definition I just want to dive a little bit more into. There is biological, cultural, but of course also linguistics. So this is the diversity of languages in the world. So much of our knowledge about nature, about each other, is tied up in languages. This builds a diversity of different worldviews, but worryingly, many languages, like biodiversity today, are in fact endangered. The other key point is that these interrelated diversities are likely in many cases co-evolved, and so maintaining the diversity of one is inseparable from the others. Now, to introduce some of the freshwater fish diversity around the world, I'm going to go on a whirlwind, rather shallow consideration looking at breadth of different biocultural relationships with fish. This is a somewhat personal journey, so there will be personal biases from where I have lived and worked, so it will primarily be examples from Asia, Europe, and Oceania. But in theory, this presentation given by someone else could focus on any different region of the world. These are just the examples I've chosen today. So to start off, given that I called the presentation Bigger Fish to Fry, this is of course because fish are all around the world used as important food. So we're going to start in Maluku. This is a town very famous for its fish restaurants on the main road west out of Kathmandu in Nepal. And it has an incredible selection of different fish dishes available to buy. This is part of a broader reliance of people on freshwater fishes for food the world over. This recent report on the world's forgotten fishes highlights that conserving the diversity and abundance of freshwater fish is incredibly important from a human well-being perspective. As this report pointed out, a huge number of people rely on subsistence fisheries of fish the world over, but especially in Asia and Africa. But people don't tend to eat just any old fish. There is often really long-term, deep-rooted underlying cultural reasoning behind why particular fish are valued as food and what they mean beyond simply being a dish. So one fish would be the pala in Sindh in Pakistan. This is a hugely popular food fish in much of South Asia. And in Sindh, I'm told that it also has a very important reasoning when you give it as a dish to a guest who is visiting. This is a real sign of honor to give this particular fish to a guest, and therefore it has this meaning beyond simply being a delicious thing to eat. Also, one of the important aspects of catching fish for food is the knowledge, skills, and traditional practices that enable the fish to be caught. For example, coracle fishing for suin in Wales is one of these traditional techniques. So the suin or sea trout. And this particular practice in West Wales was awarded the protected food name status by the European Commission, reflecting not just the relationship between fish and people, but the knowledge involved in this particular traditional form of capture. Another reason people catch fish rather than just to eat or alongside to eat is, of course, recreational fishing. So recreational fishing is massive the world over. I got the chance to go and learn fishing in Rügen in northeast Germany, and here caught a pike. On this island, the pike recreational fishery is a culturally and economically very important fishery. And for many people, this is the first way they will come across a live fish. And actually on Rügen, it's not just the recreational fishing, but the cultural importance of pike has snuck into other areas of recreation. For example, this pike-shaped seesaw in one of the children's playgrounds, which I rather love. But thinking about recreational fishing, this features a lot in the discussion and valuation of the cultural value of fish. This is because in many ways it is rather tangible. It can be economically easier to measure than other forms of cultural significance. And I think one of the other reasons that angling is important to think about is that this is often how people interact with a live fish for the very first time. And this can be a real opening into an interest in freshwater fish conservation. Of course, the other way a huge number of people get their first interaction with a live fish is through aquariums. So aquarium fish are often people's very first connection. And I think there is a concern widely among fish conservationists that freshwater fish conservation is under-considered, ignored, often underfunded. And so therefore thinking about what matters to people and how to tie in conservation to these personal relationships with fish that often emerge through fishing for food, recreation, or aquarium keeping can be really important for engaging people in conservation. Similarly, as well as just having them as pets in tanks, fish kept separate from the environment have a lot of other cultural dimensions. One example would be the plakat, or Siamese fighting fish in Thailand. It's not simply a pet, but is also part of an important traditional game. And this is a traditional cultural and social practice that is part of Thai national identity. In fact, the fighting fish is now the national aquatic animal and even featured in inspiring the costume of Miss Thailand. I was then quite fascinated to know if this was the only freshwater fish inspired costume in an international modeling competition. And I discovered Norway had also had a salmon inspired costume recently, which I love. They're rather silly, but it says something about how fish can really tie into national identity. And as well as the fish helping people define their identity, there is also the question of how we know the identity of particular fish. And the first step of this is, of course, often the name. This tells us many different things. This is a burbot, one of their names, and they have a lot of different names in different languages. And these names can tell us something about the ecological position. For example, coneyfish, meaning rabbit fish in English, reflects its behavior of living in holes, like a rabbit. Or the German name Aalraupe, or eel caterpillar, reflects a historical view that this was a form that could then go on to turn into an eel. And other European names, for example, reflect the timing in the year of their spawning migrations. Other names reflect cultural roles. For example, poor man's lobster. I actually tried this for the first time last night. When burbot is cooked in a particular way, it ends up tasting like lobster. Apparently so. I'm allergic to lobster, so I couldn't compare, but it was delicious. And the other name, for example, is lawyerfish, which I cannot comment on an open-ended webinar, but I've heard some very choice reasons as to why the burbot is called a lawyerfish. Now, these names are mostly fairly comprehensible across cultures. However, sometimes the cultural meanings of species are a little more opaque. For example, the role of the catfish in Japan as a symbol of earthquakes. Here we have a road sign that will be closed for a road closed in an earthquake, and also an app for the Earthquake Prediction Agency featuring a catfish, which to any Japanese listeners will make perfect sense because this comes from this traditional folkloric belief that a giant catfish living under the islands of Japan, when it wriggled, was the cause of earthquakes. And although this is not widely believed today, the association to earthquakes remains. As well as having visual meaning, many species also have linguistic symbolism. So to stay in Japan, this illustration by the famous artist Hokusai illustrates a Japanese idiom of unagi no bori, or eel climbing, which means when someone in society climbs inexorably, they keep sort of rising up and up in their station. And I think this is important to think about when we're trying to understand the cultural context of a species can be really helpful in designing effective conservation that works from a social standpoint as well as from an ecological one. To continue with one more idiom, hauki on kala means pike is a fish in Finnish. And this is to say that something is an obvious truth. And perhaps what this also shows is an everyday familiarity with the pike as a fish that is lacking in other regions that the pike occurs. I don't think many people I know in the UK would know what a pike was or necessarily that it was a fish. But this reflects a broader importance in Finnish society. The fish is fished and eaten, but it also stars in the Kalevala, the national epic of Finland. Here is a fresco from the National Museum in Finland where you can see a giant pike being killed, who will eventually be turned into a musical instrument from its jaw, which is on the front of this copy of the epic. And so in a lot of these epics, traditional stories and literature, the pike has a liminal role connecting between worlds. And this is seen, for example, as recently as in Fishing for the Little Pike, a recent modern Finnish best-selling book. But it goes back much further. So looking at cave art from Finland, you can see here what is thought to be a shaman going into a trance, accompanied by a pike companion, who joins him on a trance or underworld journey in which he remains surrounded by pike. So there can be these key roles of specific species to different people or nations that is then reflected, for example, in the creative expression, including artworks. This can also be seen in this epic weaved pondi, representing the importance of pondi, also called the Murray cod, to the Ngarrindjeri nation. And so cultural weaver and artist Ngarrindjeri elder Ellen Trevorrow created this sculpture woven from river rushes. And the importance of this species goes all the way back to the Ngarrindjeri creation story, in which the pondi plays an essential and important role. This is an important role is played also by the eel in the Chubdi Barahi temple in central Nepal. And here the eel is real tangible eels are found in the temple pools of this particular goddess, and they function as her companion, messenger, or sometimes interpreted as her incarnation. And this is a key part of the worship where sacrifices are fed to the eels. But as a highly migratory species, this has to go all the way from Nepal to the Bay of Bengal. So we start having to think about how multinational transboundary conservation is essential for preserving what is often very localized importance of species. So this is a sort of a localized worship within Hinduism, but you also get these localized expressions of some major world religions. So something I found out about recently was that in much of Eastern and Central Europe, the carp is traditionally eaten at Christian Christmas celebrations. And the buying of the Christmas carp is a sort of seasonal event. And apparently they are often kept in the bathtub for a few days beforehand so that they're nice and fresh for the Christmas meal. Another example of perhaps a lost significance is the eel in British culture. Alex will be talking more about this in a minute, so I won't really say anything more. But this was a species that was once hugely culturally important in the UK. And I think that it's important for this significance can help garner interest in conservation from a cultural point of view rather than just an ecological one. I think the types of people who would get very excited about the eel as something to conserve as part of the cultural heritage in the British Isles are not necessarily the same people who would view the eel as valuable as simply being part of the biodiversity of the British Isles. And so if we want to engage the broadest possible set of people in conservation, I think that these cultural histories are essential to include in communications and outreach. Another example you're about to find out a lot more about from Eden is about the tuna, an eel in New Zealand. And I just was struck by this particular statement from the strategic plan for the eels conservation, which was saying that for the Maori, to lose our tuna is to lose our identity. And I think that the central role of particular species in certain cultural identities is found the world over and is really, really, really essential for freshwater fish conservation. Another example from North America is the Namao or lake sturgeon to the Menominee people. And David Nahako Greeno, who is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Menominee, said that when the sturgeon was lost from the reservation due to downstream dams preventing the species from migrating back to the falls where they traditionally spawn, this was a very cultural and spiritual loss, a loss of food sustenance and a loss of cultural identity. So the continued relationship with healthy populations of different fish species is really important for the cultural identity, the cultural preservation of many groups of people the world over, especially many indigenous peoples. And I really love this animation that was made by a Menominee Nation high school student, imagining a future in which the lake sturgeon comes and bashes down the dam that is separating him, saying there's not a damn thing that can keep me from my people. And this thought of dams, I think, highlights that dam removal is a central consideration for much fish conservation and fish conservationists today. And it's important to see this as something that is connected to a long history of resistance to river infrastructure that has been imposed on social and ecological systems of people the world over. For as long as people have been building dams, they have been resisted. And often dams are built in a colonial context and always, of course, reflecting power structures in society. And I selected just a couple of headlines covering some of the amazing movements, especially from Indigenous, First Nations and local communities that have led movements to prevent dam building or to have dams removed. And that activism for Indigenous rights, social and environmental justice, and decolonization are things that cannot be disentangled from fish conservation. And of course, stewardship for fishes and the environment more broadly is deeply embedded in many different cultures. This is one of the things that's so important about cultural diversity. And of course, stewardship is central to effective conservation action. And I think it's worth considering that this will not always look like the type of mainstream NGO conservation that a lot of us have become used to, but in many cases can in fact be more sustainable and just. To give one specific example, this is a recent paper that has just come out by Abdul Wahid that looks at how colonial era irrigation systems and then post-independence political decisions in Pakistan have led to less than 10% of natural flows from the Indus River reaching the Indus Delta. And this leads to severe impacts on culturally important species like pala, one of the species I started this presentation with. And essentially this loss of the fish or increasing loss of the fish is the result of political decisions that have led to this technocratic governments and the proliferation of upstream dams and the marginalization of both the ecological and social system in the delta, and of course, people and fishes found there. And this figure I've chosen to include is from Wahid, gave a delta harm score. So that's a measure of the ecological and social harm impact of different policies on the delta. And you can see how throughout time, from the 1860s all the way through to the 2020s, these are still having negative impacts on the socio-ecological system of the delta. And I include this example as fish conservation cannot be considered separately from the political, historical, cultural, social, and personal context in which it is happening, not just the ecological one. The specific relationship with a given fish as well can also be a center point for social justice. This is an example of the Ainu people from Hokkaido in northern Japan who are fighting to restore their rights to fish salmon, something they have not been allowed to do for over a century. And this is a key part of Indigenous revitalization in the Ainu communities. And so as a final point, I want to highlight that, in my opinion, I think that these are issues that are relevant for species conservation the world over, but that they are particularly pertinent in freshwaters and when we're thinking about freshwater fish. And this is because water is always essential for human survival. And of course, the fish and fisheries in them are also often essential for people too, or have been in the past. For this reason, people live in close proximity to water and interact with water bodies. The water in rivers flows through us, and in time, the water in us will flow through rivers. And this leads to water use trade-offs that are deeply influenced by power in society. There is also the kind of material characteristics of freshwater systems that are rather unique in that they flow, they're connected in space and time. There's this dynamic variability of flooding and flowing downstream. And within that, the aquatic species, such as fish, that are most of the time invisible and they're spatially confined to the water, but within that water, they're often highly mobile. And often, like eels, they again have this great mystery. This sort of comes together to mean there is a real codependence of freshwater, people, and of course then fishes, and each are sensitive to changes in the other, with resultant social, ethical, and governance consequences. And so you can't depoliticize social decisions related to water, including fish conservation. We can't just think about fish in an ecological context. We have to think about the flows of responsibility we have to other communities, to fish communities, and also about the biodiversity decline in terms of the symptomatic causes of that decline, as well as the systematic sort of social causes that underlie those. And to end, I think that consideration of the different relationships that we have with fish is an important facet of understanding how fish conservation can contribute to social and environmental justice or entrench injustices. And doing so allows us to develop context-relevant conservation that is just and therefore more ethical and effective into the long term. So thank you very much for your attention. I apologize that I think I have overrun on time.
No, that was that was so fascinating, Phoebe. Thanks so much. It's absolutely fine that you went maybe a couple of minutes over. That final point there about water's essentiality to humanity is so key, isn't it? And how the waters that we live by are literally and figuratively kind of reflections of ourselves, and how fishes are such a kind of key component of that. So many cool examples of cultural significance of fishes there, and I absolutely love Norway's salmon-inspired catwalk. There should definitely be more fish-related songs and costumes on catwalks, and yeah, it looks like it should belong in the Eurovision Song Contest. Incredible. Alexander, Alex, are you ready to pull your presentation up as well?
Yep. Okay, can you see that? Oh, good. Okay, so I'm going to be looking a little bit more closely at the European eel, which, as I was saying before this discussion, is I think it becomes something of an obsession. It's one of those things where you scratch beneath the surface, and there's just so much to it. And for me, as somebody who's traditionally looked at sort of literature as a research method, it's also a very rich source because eel is everywhere. And for me, in particular, like I'm interested in Victorian literature, and the eel has sort of an interesting role to play. Um, a very different role to that of sort of traditional game fish like salmon and trout. And one that sometimes is almost there's a sense of its cultural richness, but also a sense of its absence or invisibility. And that's why I'm going to be looking at what I call Gothic ecologies, which is sort of that subliminal messaging that's associated with the eel and its symbolism and its role in culture. So here you can see this picture. It's still from the Elverman, and you can kind of just get a sense of this mysticism around sort of eel fishing, and the unique culture around fishing for alphas at night. And that I'm sort of intending that that sort of sets the scene for what we're going to be looking at, which is this sort of other world of ecology and fishing, that the eel sort of opens up for us. So to define the Gothic mode is difficult. I think it's one of those things where it's very commonly used in literary theory and criticism, um, but it's quite a slippery term. The two terms that I find most useful are from Gerald Hogel and Eve Sedgwick. So the first, the Gothic provides the best known examples of those strange and ghostly figures that Freud saw as examples of the uncanny in his 1919 essay of that name. For him, what is quintessentially uncanny, as he reveals most by analysing the German Gothic tale The Sandman, is the deeply and internally familiar, as it reappears to us, seemingly external, repellent, and unfamiliar forms. So there's kind of this sense that you're seeing something that you know exists, but you've never actually witnessed in reality. So you have this sudden material revelation where something that's imaginary or something that's very conceptual becomes concrete. Um, so that's one definition. And then another definition that I find useful is from Eve Sedgwick, who says that there is in these novels, so Gothic novels, that is, um, a large, important group of quite specific conventions, structural and thematic. The units of this model are often not coterminous with fictional selves, nor does the model necessarily demarcate areas that sort of qualitatively, um, effectively or atmospherically different from each other. Although this has informed critical attempts to value the Gothic for its portrayal of depth, a shift of focus shows that even here, the strongest energies in here in the surface. Now that's interesting because the Gothic, often when you talk about it, is about, as I mentioned right at the beginning, it's about scratching beneath the surface. But what's strange about Gothic as a concept is it can sort of mean that something that is, um, as I said, something that's not there very much becomes present. So it's sort of about coming from depth to the surface. And that's something that is very pertinent when it comes to study of the eel, and hence that's why I'm going to be looking at it today. Okay, so here are some words that I've taken from various critical sources used to describe Gothic concepts. So unnatural echoes or silences, doubles, apparitions from the past, the uncanny, the unseen or invisible, unintelligible happenings, fragmented histories, darkness, nocturnal landscapes, layered existences, queerness, the unspeakable, the absurd. Now, obviously, all of these kind of concepts could be applied to bats. They could be applied to werewolves if we're moving into the realm of pure fiction, or it could equally be applied to eels. Because what's strange about the eel and its ecology is it is unintelligible to many of us, and as may some of you may know, it wasn't until very recently that we were actually able to determine where eels come from. I mean, so there was Aristotle originally thought that eels came out of the mud, and that view sort of persisted through to around sort of the 18th century, but even then it didn't fully disappear. And the studies into the whether the eel had sexual organs, that continued well into the 20th century, and there's plenty of as well as there being lots of interesting scientific research that you can sort of get your teeth into. There are lots of literary accounts sort of discussing this and what happened, and how that might be how this research sort of informed our understanding of the eel as impossible and absurd. Yeah. Okay, so in Gothic Animals, Melissa Edmondson says, speaking of Derrida's cat, which is this, I mean, you've probably heard of this, but it's this sort of anecdote that Derrida has of his cat seeing him naked and the strange sense of the cat as sort of being, which is not necessarily always immediately obvious, sort of the sense that it has its own um, cultural codes, its own sense of judgment, its own sense of pride and shame. And she refers to Derrida's cat to say that the gaze of Derrida's cat, like the mere presence of any animal, can destabilize foundational beliefs about reality, inspiring creature terror. This terror is not exactly a monster terror, rather, it is more of a viscerally uncanny encounter, a brush with the other that shifts perception, creates discomfort and uncertainty, and points to countless wells of perception which are forever closed to. And this, I would say, equally applies to the eel, this other world that we don't really know. When we see an eel in the river, it suddenly transforms our image of the river from being something that has one cultural code. So sort of the connotations of a river teeming with trout are quite different to a river filled with eels. And there's also been a darkness associated with that in the sense that, eels feeding on carrion and um, eel pits and things like this. But I think there's also a beauty to that as well. And I don't think the two things are necessarily separable. So again, back to the Elfman from Isla Badnoch. Um, I'm going to show you three stills here. And you can see each of those refers to a different element that's unexpected, and ostensibly Gothic as well. Now, I would say that as much as the eel itself is Gothic, so too is the fishing for eels late at night. The going out and immersing yourself in this world that other people don't necessarily understand or know about, because that also separates you and that also designates you as sort of other, to a certain extent. Yeah. So, what do eels do in Gothic literature? Now, this is obviously the key question for me, being a somebody who basically works in literature purely. Now, at one level, eels function like all animals as omens, extensions of the psyche, and as windows into alternative forms of existence. As I've mentioned, their presence compels us to look beyond the human scale and to think beyond the human experience. And by that I mean we tend to have these anthropocentric views of the world around us, where we see things like size, things like shape are all characterized by the fact that we're a certain size and a certain shape, and that our eyes perceive things in a certain way. But obviously, when you understand that animals see things differently, that forces you to think differently. And that was particularly important in the 19th century because obviously, as Darwin's Origin of Species started to sort of well bulldoze popular culture, basically. Um, Novels engage deeply with this issue. Thomas Hardy, my personal favorite author, was fascinated by insect worlds because he said that they're of no different status to our worlds, but equally, and to a certain extent, more significantly, are grander because for an insect, the scale of the world is so much bigger. So for eels, equally, it's a completely different experience of the world. They're crossing between land and water and so on and so forth. So more particularly eels, one's comprising more than 50% of England's freshwater biomass. So that's talking about before the Norman conquest. But that's pretty substantial. They represent the persistence of old or lost cultures, the increasingly strained or uneven relationship between human and non-human animals as those cultures have been lost. And the transition from localized to international markets as people no longer recognize where their food comes from. Their obscurity and relative invisibility help support claims of detachment from nature and food supply chains. Now, reading Gothic literature through Freud, through Marx, through Darwin can introduce new theoretical questions regarding the eel symbolism, its origin, its strange behaviors such as cannibalism, and its status as ferae naturae, which is an animal with no legal owner, which in English culture is hugely significant because salmon and trout have traditionally been privileged as fish. Um, Coarse fishing has generally been looked down on to a certain extent, and eel fishing sort of falls broadly within that category, even though eels are not coarse, so to speak, because they're able to be caught. Basically, they don't belong to the person whose land adjoins the river, so they are free. They're sort of anyone's gain, basically. So that kind of contributes to a class dynamic as well, which is quite interesting to think about. But yeah. So first off, I'm going to show you one of my favorite books, Great Expectations. Great Expectations provides an opportunity for you to think about how we can filter not only filter the eel through a Gothic lens, but filter the Gothic through the eel's lens. To take this conversation, which happens when Pip encounters Magwitch for the first time in the wetlands of Kent. Now, these stills are from David Lean's adaptation, which is still my favorite film of all time. So, if you want to talk about that, just let me know. I saw a fearful man, all in coarse grey, a man who had been soaked in water and smothered in mud. Now, that's significant. Good night, sir, I faltered. Much of that, said he, glancing about him over the cold, wet flat. I wish I was a frog or an eel. At the same time, he hugged his shuddering body in both his arms, clasping himself as if to hold himself together, and limped towards the low church wall. The marshes were just along a long, black, horizontal line then, as I stopped to look after him. And the river was just another horizontal line, not nearly so broad, nor yet so black. Now, if we read this passage, I know it can sound far-fetched, but it can provide an opportunity to actually see Magwitch's at least to align Magwitch's perspective with that of an eel. Now, he's smothered in mud. He hugs his shuddering body. Um, he's climbing up a church wall, which we'll come to later. He sees the world as a black horizontal line before him, and he's defined purely by these marshes. And whilst that might whilst it's Dickens isn't necessarily saying that Magwitch is an eel, he's saying that he embodies many of his characteristics, and his invisibility definitely forms part of that, but also his isolation and his increasingly his sort of decreasing significance in an evolving world, which is as Phoebe sort of gestured towards earlier. Oh, this is still at the beginning of just the vastness of the wetlands. They've completely changed since this film came about. I've actually retraced all of these steps from this film, and yeah, it's quite sad, really. Thomas Hardy, Nighttime in Mid-Fall, also wrote about eel, and he continues the idea of the church wall. But instead of using the eel as a way to enrich our understanding of character, he instead uses it to inform our understanding of landscape. I'll just read the poem for you. It is a storm-strid night, wind's footing swift, through the blind profound. I know the happenings from their sound. Leaves totter down still green and spin and drift. The tree trunks rocked their roots, which wrench and lift the loam where they run onward underground. The streams are muddy and swollen, eels migrate to a new abode. Even crossed, 'tis said, the turnpike road. Men's feet have felt their crawl home coming late. The westward fronts of towers are saturate. Church timbers crack, and witches ride abroad. Now, witches, churches, I mean, there's lots of Gothic imagery here. But also there's this sense that whilst the eel is often characterized as something dark and sinister, the actual danger here is humanity because it's the men walking home along the turnpike road, another man-made obstacle that actually have the impact on the eels and not the other way around. So as gruesome as it might be, the idea of eels climbing up the church, they're actually completely harmless, and it's humanity that we're actually questioning here. Um, yeah. Similarly, there's this sense that do we know that the eels exist? Do we know that they are So bear in mind that when Hardy wrote that, he didn't know where eels were migrating from. Do we know where they come from? Why they emerge in these massive numbers and then disappear completely from view? Not really. And in the Trumpet Major, Hardy paints this really fascinating scene of somebody sort of sticking night lines into the banks of the mill pond. This Bob Loveday, one of the key characters. And he draws up in the morning a family of fat eels, some of which were skinned and prepared for his breakfast. But that's not necessarily the interesting bit. I mean, it is interesting to think that you could do that back then, but they were his favorite fish, but he'd forgotten that they existed. So he didn't even the fact that they could just disappear from cultural memory like that, I think says a lot about how humans sort of tend to value nature. And how as soon as the sort of practical use case has sort of ridden its course, then there's a tendency to just sort of imagine that these animals are not there, and this is an opportunity to sort of rebuild that relationship. Yeah, so fascinating when it comes to memory as well. Now, in Victorian London, as all of you probably know, the jelly deals were a popular dish, so were stew deals. Um, but strangely, most of these didn't actually come from the Thames. Um, so in Dickens's Dictionary of the Thames, which is actually Charles Dickens's son's book, he said eels have greatly fallen off in individual size and collective numbers of late years in the Thames. There is little doubt that here they are poisoned in the bad water in company with other migratory fish that seek the ocean. And the supply of eels to the metropolis and the hotels along the Thames is mostly from Holland. The Dutch buses, very picturesque vessels from Holland, may be seen any day off Billingsgate at anchor, waiting for their wells of eels upon the requirements of the market. Now, as I was saying earlier, there's this detachment from the supply chain. So whereas previously eels were consumed in London because London is essentially, especially the East End of London, which was historically the poorest part, is sort of an estuarine city. So eels obviously move between salt and fresh water, and estuaries are a good place to catch them. Um, but obviously, as the Thames was gradually polluted and barriers started to appear, there was obviously, so he actually attributes it to obstacles opposing their natural habit of making for the estuary to spawn. Um, but as these barriers start to appear, then you're no longer able to get eels from the Thames, but the cultural tradition sort of lives on. So they have to like meet the demand in a different way. But a lot of people actually didn't know that. So a lot of people would still think that the eels came from London, but they didn't. And the Dutch eel barges were very prominent in the Tudor times, where essentially it was more of a trade situation, and they were very prominent in the sense that you could avoid paying tax for local eels if you caught a little ferry out to a boat and took them off the ship directly. Um, but by the Victorian times, this was all a very sort of invisible trade network. When you went to Billingsgate, you wouldn't necessarily know that these eels had actually come from the Netherlands and that the Thames stock had declined. This was slightly different to salmon, where it was actually part of the uh, branding, so to speak. But yeah, so eel was a very popular working class food in the East End of London, but not necessarily, the eel didn't necessarily come from London. So I think we're a little bit short on time, so I maybe missed this one. But yeah. So are eels always gothic? Now, no. But then you could argue that some of these representations of eels in comedy do have elements of that to them. So obviously famously Monty Python, My Hovercraft is Full of Eels, where he has a Hungarian phrase book that mistranslates, he's actually asking for a box of matches. Um, but again, there's something silly and ridiculous about the eels being and not knowing where they are, and King Lear, cry to it, Nuncle, as the Cockney did to the eels when she put him in the paste alive. She napped him over the coxcombs with a stick and cried, Down, Wantons, down. Again, ridiculous. But again, there's like a darkness to it there. I mean, she's there's kind of this linkage to like cultural history of the East End of London, but there's also sort of this linkage to violence. And obviously, eels are not particularly easy to, unlike other fish, you can't just take them out of the water and they die. So it's quite a gruesome sometimes in the way you have to kill eels. So kind of it's very visceral, this image. Mighty Boosh, ridiculous. Eel song, eels up inside you, finding an interest where they can. Quite dark. But again, this sort of Freudian readings, maybe interesting. And the trumpet major, again, what I mentioned about the night lines, that's quite strange that he like pulls up a family of eels. I mean, it's sort of a reflection on human impacts on the environment. Um, but also this way that why can't you also have like a positive relationship with eels in culture, like one that's quite productive? And there's this line which I love. Um, I've never, I don't know if I'd recommend using this with anybody, but her eyes would have been called brown, but really they were eel color, like many other nice brown eyes. So you can actually use eel in a positive way, um, in that sense. Um, these kinds of readings, Gothic readings of the eel in can extend beyond literature. Eels in Gothic art is interesting. I mean, thinking church paintings in particular. Um, there's a church in Norfolk which has a big painting in red ochre of a Alverman. Oral histories of eel fishing. I used to run a project with SEG where we spoke to fishermen, people who worked on the eel barge, all sorts of people who just had so much to contribute because there's all these cultures that are invisible. And as I said, that invisibility and that otherworldliness is sort of very, very much part of the Gothic tradition. Architectural history. My background and my interest has always been in architecture and literary representations of architecture. It sort of moved into ecology over time as I started becoming interested in sort of landscape analysis and environmental impact assessments. Um, but it doesn't necessarily have to just be about the environmental implications of architectural history. It can also be about how architecture itself is built to respond to the eel. So this eel house here in Alresford, this picture is just so rich. Um, basically, that was used to catch eels moving down the River Arle in Oxford, which actually derived from eel. Um, Communications, you could use Gothic imagery in communications. At SEG, we generally don't do this, but it's definitely something to consider because it's the viscerality of Gothic kind of really draws people in. And then affect studies and queer theory, these kind of the emotional impact of eels and the sense of otherness and how that culture around eel fishing and in sort of engaging with eels relates to the self. I think is really fascinating. Yeah, so that's all from me. So if you have any questions or anything, feel free to email me or speak to me about my PhD research, which is considering the impact of Victorian water engineering solutions on freshwater fish stocks, particularly the eel. My work at SEG, and then my work with CITES, which is trying to create a level playing field at the moment for all anguillid species in international trade because the European eel is protected, but there are lots of other endangered species that, unfortunately, or vulnerable species that are facing increasing pressure as a result of those protections as the supply looks elsewhere. But yeah, okay, so that's all for me. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Alex. What a fantastic comparison to think of eels in the same category as bats and werewolves, these slippery, unintelligible, uncanny apparitions, shapeshifter creatures of the unknown. I love that. Each time I talk with Alex, he uncovers more and more layers of the incredibly complex relationship between people and eel. And I love the phrase that eels, their existence compels us to think beyond the human experience. And it's really, I actually didn't know that. That's incredible fact that the European eel once comprised more than 50% of England's freshwater biomass, which makes it all the more poignant, obviously, that populations have crashed over the past couple of decades and that the species is now listed as critically endangered. Thanks so much for that talk. That was really fascinating. And Eden is also going to talk about an eel as well, which helps again to show the incredible richness of the relationship between people and these species.
Awesome. Right, can you hear me? That's a yes. Cool. Currently it's midnight where I am, so do bear with me if I start to bat my eyes too much. I am currently in New Zealand. I've come home from living in the UK. Usually I would do a slightly different talk, and there's going to be a wee bit of doom and gloom throughout this, and unfortunately you'll see some unfortunate circumstances about eels. But I hope to also, it's a almost a bit of a reality check in terms of some of the damage and degradation. And it's in many ways very sad what New Zealand has gone through, but I do think there's some really unique opportunities and work that's being done, and I'll touch on some of that from different areas, but also some of the work that I'm directly involved with. From my perspective, I'm very, very much involved in environmental projects, currently working on an Indigenous economics research project at the moment, which has some relationship to kind of food gathering and various other things in our connection to the environment. But from my speaking point, it's very much from someone that's lived and grown and caught lots of eels. I'm thinking about some of the idioms that Phoebe was mentioning, and we have one of our own that we use, which is called para te huarahi, which literally translates to cleaning the slime off an eel. And what that refers to is someone that's out there doing the work that's needed on the environment, in the wetlands, in the lakes, to try to look after them or to feed people. So my talk today is about kaha te tino ki te roto, kaha te reo ki te kaikaika, kaha te takitaki ki te whenua. Obviously, I don't expect you to be able to repeat that, but from that, I want you to get the essence and the importance of the interconnectedness that we have. So in that first statement, kaha te tino ki te roto, that's saying if the lake is full of eels, kaha te reo ki te kaikaika. If our traditional language is spoken in our homes, and our language is really interconnected with the environment, there's lots of references and various other things that help you understand the influence of the environment in our language. And then kaha te takitaki te whenua. It means that the people in the land will be well. But it can also mean if there's not many eels in the lake, or people aren't speaking the language at home, then the lake, then the land and the people will be unwell. The part of this talk, I'll dive into that a wee bit deeper. In terms of a bit of context setting, yes, New Zealand is very far away. It's quite a small country. I'm not sure what you will know about it, but in terms of the key points and the context setting for this presentation, one, we're one of the last countries to be discovered or, I guess, colonized. So Māori explored and pioneered Aotearoa about 800, 900 years ago, quite a small population, and it wasn't until about 1840 there was a treaty signed, and then the years following the population grew in the order of hundreds of thousands, but still very small number of people for a very large, rich, diverse area. In terms of some of the biodiversity, you get all sorts of strange birds. Most of our native birds can't fly because they were so isolated that they've evolved that they can't fly anymore because they didn't need to because there was no predators, or no major predators that affected them. Unfortunately, we've lost about 90% of our wetlands. So this lake, which is going to be a case study, which I'll dive into, which was a really significant lake to where I'm from, But there's also been a significant amount of wetlands around that lake, which have been converted into farms. And I'm sure you can see that in terms of all the kind of square patches. And the final point before I move into the sort of case studies and the key areas is looking at the role of, I guess, personification. And then so people may have used these terms before, but it's something that we use a lot in our culture, as I've described with that idiom, is thinking about, what's the role of wetlands? And often we describe them as almost like kidneys. So they're filtering out a lot of the things that come through in the environment. Unfortunately, humans have put lots of shit and other things in the environment, and it means that those wetlands are filtering a lot more. If you think about a lake, sometimes we refer to that as almost like a lung, but there's lots of oxygen stored in that lake, and it has a role in terms of contributing water out and helping oxygenate the lands and give it life. And I guess the third thing, which I'll note in terms of personification, is thinking about the rivers and how they can be personified, and it's almost like the blood that sort of runs through your body, and it helps ensure that your body's working functionally. And it's a bit like that with rivers if you think about biodiversity and various other things. Just something to think about. And I did say finally, but finally, the context setting is thinking about I'm an Indigenous person, so I'm from Ngāi. This is part of my traditional territories of the South Island of New Zealand. Most of the South Island, not all of it, but about 80% is under the Tribal Protection Authority of Ngāi. So when we think about wetlands, because it's World Wetland Day, it was almost like a pantry cupboard or food storage, because wetlands had so much biodiversity, so much sort of breeding of fish and various other things. So when you think about how important wetlands were, it'd be like if someone came into your house and they were trying to take food out of your pantry, in terms of if people were trying to fill your wetlands in and damage them, or if they were trying to take food, these were really sacred, important places for food gathering, but they were also really important for protection as well, where people would seek safety back in the day during different times. That's just a bit of context setting. Let's go into the case study, which I've mentioned. Awesome. Cool. As I mentioned to Wairewa, that translates to the spreading of waters. So it's a very sort of large lake, but it's also quite shallow, very far. In terms of a quick profile, so the size of it is about 20,000 hectares. That's been shrunk by half. So I'll show you a bird's eye overview of how significant that is and what that has meant in terms of the ecosystems that it's provided. Some of the cultural significance, the original name of this lake that we were just looking at was called Te Kete Ika o Rākaihotu, which translates to the fish basket of Rākaihotu. So he was one of the early pioneers who came about 800 years ago on the Waka, and there's lots of stories and traditions about how he came through, and often quite a bit of hyperbole in terms of these adventures that he went on, literally digging up these lakes with his core or paddle that he used to sail over from. But even that name in itself, the fish basket, refers to an abundance and why people would settle there, because it was so rich in fish. And I'll go into some of that in some of the projects very shortly. Some of the challenges which I'll highlight in this is what they've described as the nitrate emergency. So last year, the regional or local government declared a nitrate emergency. It was a wee bit of politicking, but for quick context, in terms of getting an understanding of the scale of farms and the input of nitrate into the wider area within Canterbury, the wider regions, and not just around the lake. In 1990, there was only 112,000 cows. I say only, there's still lots of cows, dairy cows as well. 2023, it's now 1.25 million cows. So within that 33-year time period, there's just been an absolute boom of cows. For those that don't know the impact of cows. They have a significant impact on the nitrate intensification, especially dairy, that then goes into aquifers and then gets run out. That nitrate turns into algae and various other things and puts more pressure on those wetlands to be able to filter them. It's almost like drinking straight spirits, I guess, rather than just having a beer or getting into it. Your body can't handle it, and the wetlands can't handle it. If you've got 1.25 million cows in the area in Freshwater. Obviously, synthetic fertilizers came in the early 2000s fast as well. Exhausted and overfished and the environmental challenges. Just a bit of a warning, some of the photos I do show you are quite distressing in terms of the environment. The first is just a graph on the quota catch take, which shows the significance of this lake. And then the second one is about an environmental challenge that we need to work with, but effectively it's a result of the shrinkage and drainage of the lake. So for context, there's Te Waihoara there, the scale, 40,000 hectares, it would have been twice that size. So it was pushing a lot more to Christchurch, the city. Those that don't know, Christchurch had an earthquake in sort of 2010 that was quite significant. They put it on the map, and a few other things as well, which I won't mention, but things of overfish. So think about it like 20,000 hectares. This is some of the data that was put forward in the tribe's settlement claim. So to have our rights recognised, this is some of the information said. We have rights here, and this is the challenges and issues that we're facing. So in terms of the fishing quota, this is from Ministry of Primary Industries or Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, as it was at the time. And if you look at, so flats is just like a flounder or like a sole, it's similar to a sole, and then yellow-eyed mullet, if you know what that is, and eels. But if you look at the sort of early introduction from 1961, there was only, I say only, there's 25 tons of eels that was first caught in that lake commercially, and that scaled up within 16 years that 847 commercial eels were caught in 1 year. And then as you can imagine what happened after that in terms of the population declining. And that's also after the lake has shrunk up in size. And similarly with the flounders as well. So this is a lake that we've had a long intergenerational connection with, way back to Barty to 800 years ago. No one cared for is the significant lake of a place that would be able to fish from, would live close to, would have families nearby. And then you're seeing this disastrous overfishing, which is something that we're working on, and I'll discuss what we are doing. This is one of the environmental challenges. Usually I talk about Wairewa, which is a bit more of a positive story, but I think it's something that is really poignant and has happened about the last 3 or 4 years. This happens when there's large king tides, and as a result of climate change and the increasing deposit, the shingle bar between the lake and the ocean is widening further and further, which means if it's a high tide night and the eels smell the salt and they want to migrate over land, that land is further than what it was before. But what that means is if it's a king tide, they might think that they can go up because they could have done it at other times. And then what happens is at night time, often around midnight or 10 p.m. when it's very late, you see these mass migrations, and then people will be up in the morning and they'll see this horrific scene. That's something that is a very difficult thing to overcome. It's very sad for us as a people. So in terms of, I mentioned about sort of my backgrounds, getting stuck in, doing the work, seeing what I can do. There's lots of issues, as you can say. I've just pointed out 2 of them and several others. The 2 areas that I wanted to focus on was the legal arrangement and Indigenous rights. But then secondly, what I'm probably more interested in is actually environmental restoration. What stuff that can be tangible that you can do right now. The legal arrangements, I will copy and paste and put that in the chat. There's all sorts of stuff. So that lake currently has a co-governance of the lake bed. The issue with that is all the nitrate's not coming from the lake bed, it's coming from all the dirty farms right next to it, and then the hundreds of farms behind them. So if you can't deal with that, there's not much point owning the worst part of the lake, which is the bottom of the sediment, where there's not much oxygen and all the other bad stuff. But that's a case study which I'll share in the chat. Legislation for river management. So the Waikato River Authority, another tribe within their legal Indigenous settlement, they had that recognised that the government and the Crown needs to provide resources and support to ensure the effective management of that river, the largest river in New Zealand. Each year they're effectively given millions of dollars for freshwater projects to ensure that it's looked after, such as riparian planting, eel transfers, various other things that the community will put in for to ensure that it's looked after to sort of combat all these competing pressures. Third thing, a legal challenge. So my tribe is actually taking the Crown to court based on the settlement legislation to have a greater role in freshwater management of the South Island. We hold about 80% of New Zealand's freshwater in our tribal area. Most of that goes on irrigation for farms and dairy cows. You can have legislation to support and protect your eel fishery. So in another lake, which is neighbouring, much smaller, we had a commercial fisher come on our lake. Obviously, we didn't want them catching 867 tonnes of eels as they did on the other one. So we ended up fighting that and going to Parliament and getting the first recognised Māori eel fishery, which was in that legislation. Effectively, what that means is that it's off limits for commercial and most of the recreational, and that we hold permit rights for who can catch and when they can be caught. Lots of people interested in personhood status for some reason, so I'll put some examples of that in and what that means. I guess my comment on that is, how is it effective from blocking development? It's almost there ready to be used, but no one's tested it in the courts. And I believe it was last year, the River Sign in Paris has just been given its legal personhood, so it'll be interesting to see how they adapt that. In terms of the environmental projects, some good things that have been going on. There's always the question of financing nature. That lake, unfortunately, has hundreds of millions of dollars of externalities from dirty dairy farms that just get stuck into that lake. What would it cost to repair it? What would it cost in terms of the time? What would it cost for dredging? What would it cost for developing artificial or recreating wetlands? What would it cost to buy out the farmers' lands and restore them? These are all significant questions. During COVID, the government put out a Jobs for Nature program to help create stimulus. Effectively, they put in billions of dollars for environmental restoration so people can have jobs and be active, but there's lots of amazing case studies. Just briefly, that's the last slide. My lake at Wairewa, we have the same challenges with migration, especially glass eels coming in. We fortunately don't have as much of an issue with releasing them and then getting stuck in the shingle bar, but the bar is getting wider and it is more difficult for glass eels to then come into the lake. So we're looking at a significant fish pass to assist with the glass eel migration, and then also lake management. So we always have lots of contention and butting heads with the local authority around flood management and various other things. Restoring wetlands, this is something that I'm really passionate about, especially after understanding that there were some traditional eel farms that our ancestors effectively dug. So we would dig these kind of almost pools to then bring in eels and then block it off and then to sort of feed them up and protect them in these wetland areas and almost use it as a farm, but within a wetland construct. Engaging local students, education pays the best dividends, as we know, and especially in environmental awareness. I think so many people don't necessarily get out in their own backyard, so we're working closely with our local high school and also university students regularly coming out doing assignments, using their smart brains, the future, to help us figure out what we can do. And then for me, what I'm really passionate about is engaging Indigenous people in traditional food gathering. Now, it's not about just filling your belly. It's not about just filling your families or your neighbour's belly. It's about getting out there and also understanding the environment, understanding the observations of how many eels you might see, understanding that there might be lots of algae on top of it. So you're building up this environmental quotient effectively of how is the environment changing around me? How is it all connecting in with the lakes and the rivers to then be better informed in terms of what we can do in the catch? So that's me. I'll leave it there because hopefully there's lots of questions and just like to acknowledge all of you that are here from around the world and also my panellists, Alex, Phoebe, and thank you to the organisers. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Eden. And I believe Eden is currently joining us from Aotearoa in New Zealand, where the time now is it midnight? So, so thank you very much for accommodating a really antisocial time to participate in the webinar. That's much appreciated. Georgie and I were lucky enough to see Alex, Phoebe, and Eden at the first international conference on the significance of fishes in Ely in, I'm tempted to say June, I can't remember now, but it was fascinating. And just a quick question to you, Eden. In that conference, I remember you mentioned a Maori creation story about the tuna. Is that right? Do you mind just saying a little bit about that creation story? Because I remember it being really interesting.
Yeah, no worries. There's lots of different versions. The Pacific have their own creation story. Effectively, there's this sort of deity Tūngaroa that then comes down to because he gets too close to the sun and ends up finding himself in one of these lakes, and then tell you what, I'll find it and I'll put it in the chat for people to read because there's a bit there, and I don't want to kind of rush over and get the names on and so forth. But it's looks at this kind of personification, and effectively the Tūngaroa ends up effectively being killed, but then there's certain parts of him that get thrown into the environment and then form different parts, and it helps describe the relationship between some of these species that how we understand it today in terms of the conger eel and the freshwater angler eel and various other things as well. So I'll find that and put that in the chat.
Brilliant, thank you. And we'll link to that information after the event. We'll promote it on social media and put it in next month's newsletter so people can get access to that literature as well. Mohammed Ikram has put a question to Phoebe. Eels have been a main tourist attraction in a small natural pond in Sulawesi, Indonesia, where a couple of endemic fry species coexist. Due to the population of endemics shrinking, one of the species might even be extinct in the pond. Ikram's team is going to go and carry out a reintroduction program for the fry, which we lately realize about the role of eels for the local as an attraction might be a challenge. So the locals normally call the eels by cracking a lot of eggs in the water, which presumably have polluted the water and eventually affect the survival of other endemic fish. From a conservation perspective, how is best to approach such a case where the locals value more than the non-native bigger fish than the smaller endemic fish, where the locals value the non-native bigger fish more than the small endemic fish that are on the brink of extinction? Telling the locals to stop feeding the eels with eggs might not be straightforward. And Ikram was also wondering if there's a sort of example from around the world where such a case might exist. Are you able to speak to that?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much for sharing that example. It sounds like a complex conservation challenge. And I think this is something that actually does come up over and over again, is that larger fishes are introduced the world over because they have this social and economic value, and this can create challenges, especially for smaller native fishes. There's a paper by researcher Xing Chen, which is about to come out, which highlights examples from around the world where there have been these purposeful introductions of megafauna. Also, I'm just fascinated that there's somewhere else where people are feeding eggs to eels. This is like a tourist attraction that people keep sending me from different parts of the world on Instagram. So I'm like, I just kind of love that all over the world people have this idea of feeding eggs to eels in temples or in certain pools, and it keeps coming up. I think that in this context, the specific solution that works will always be very kind of locally and context dependent. And I would say the best approach is usually just getting the community involved at the earliest possible stage in order to co-develop a solution that will probably inevitably be a compromise, but trying to find a way forward that enables the elements of the relationship with eels that people want to maintain, but in a way that maybe minimizes the negative impact on the smaller species. I can't say what that will look like, but I think that the co-creating solutions and kind of listening to everyone's perspectives and reasons for these different practices from the get-go is usually the best way forward. And I feel like when people feel completely involved and when they have a sort of genuine participatory role in developing the solution, that's when conservation works best. I see from the comment that you're based in Berlin, so am I. So always happy to chat, but I can also send some examples of co-development of solutions that might be a useful approach.
Brilliant question, brilliant answer. Thanks so much, Phoebe. Thanks, Ikram. Alex, a question to you. You mentioned Hardy and Dickens a lot in your talk. Are there any other writers who have focused deeply on the species? Are there some books that you'd recommend to find the eel in literature?
Well, the thing about the eel is very rarely the focus of the text, but it tends to appear sort of in passing in reference to London or in reference to the rivers. I mean, obviously, I specialize in Victorian literature, but um, if you want to read anything, so from that time, I would say one of the most interesting is Hereward the Wake by Kingsley. That's actually a story of wetland. It's a peculiar story. Wetland drainage basically leading to the destruction of the main characters who were originally protected by wetlands, and then it's all disappeared. So eels feature in there. I mean, you see them in yeah, all of the major Victorian writers really. I mean, one of the ones that I skipped over, Miss, is by Compton Reed. She's just like a very very minor writer. Not really had much attention, but that text, The Maid of the Mill, is essentially I mean, there's like a whole passage in it which just deals with the issue of eel traps, and the how enclosure acts in the UK basically had the effect of restricting in so restricting access to space, but also undermining this sort of localized pattern of conservation, where essentially landowners tried to take as much as they could from the land that they owned. So that's quite an interesting one. But I mean, really, as a starting point, I would suggest going for like Tom Fort's The Book of Eels, or there's also The Gospel of the Eels by Svensson, I believe. They're probably good starting points because you're not gonna, there aren't many eel-centric Victorian novels, but I can guarantee you if you're interested in anything representing London or rivers, you'll see eels emerge. Yeah, because they do a lot. Yeah,
Emerge from the shadowy world that they
they
came
do. Yeah, it takes a lot of digging to find these passages. Yeah.
from. Thanks for that. Well, those books on the list. This is a very broad, extremely broad top level question, but really sort of crucial to the spirit of World Wetlands Day and this conversation. And it's a question to everyone, so feel free to jump in. What more are we losing as we witness the degradation of wetlands and the decline of freshwater species? Aside from the actual wetlands and the species themselves, what else are we losing? Does anyone want to take that? I mean, I guess it's sort of we're losing an aspect of ourselves and losing a there's this idea of a secondary extinction. If we lose species, then we also lose the sort of cultural connections with the species as well. And we lose indigenous knowledge, we lose historical connections, and we're losing a big sort of chunk of culture and ourselves. So I just wondered if anyone wants to jump in and say anything to that very sort of top level question. If not, that's fine. We can move on.
I can jump in there because it's quite poignant, especially in Aotearoa. There's been a significant revitalisation of language, which is incredible because at one point we almost lost the language in about 1905. There's very few speakers and there's been a rejuvenation of that. Um, but in terms of our traditional kind of food gathering practices, is really core thing to our identity. Again, it's not just it's sort of the lifeblood of our connection with the environment that you're out there, uh, you understand certain species, what's happening, you understand the populations, you understand their migration cycles, you understand when and when not to catch them, including which ones you don't catch. For example, the large migratory ones, and we have about 10, 12 different names of eels during that, so you can identify which ones you have. So for us, it's really losing our identity. It is so crucial to who we are. I mean, there's the speaking the language, but then being able to exercise mahinga kai, which means to be able to work the food, to be able to go out there. I had I was fortunate enough to meet a significant activist in New Zealand history, and one of the questions that he would ask people is, how much of the food in your fridge is from your area? And that was almost like a measurement, basically, because if you're not, then you know, it's like when people ask you, for those that are from a certain culture and you can't speak the language, and they ask you, they start talking to you in that language and you can't speak it back. It's almost like that in terms of you don't understand what's happening in your environment. Your wetlands are screwed, your species are screwed, so you're losing who you are as well. So that's kind of what it means for us to be really poignant.
I suppose I'd also say, sort of from a historical vantage point, that there's this sense that a lot of that culture associated with wetlands is already lost as well. This kind of, I mean, so if you think about, sort of, Ely was an island. I mean, Glastonbury was an island. All of those places that have sort of had a very resonant position in the Middle Ages. And I mean, obviously, I'm thinking from a not as a sort of 19th century, specializing in sort of English, sort of local histories, really. These kind of shifts from a landscape that was very much characterized by wetlands and local identities that were very much characterized by wetland sort of fishing practices and even navigation, that was sort of gone already, and it now takes a lot of effort to remind people that that existed once. And in the 19th century, there's a lot of interest from people like Ruskin, Pugin, William Morris, who were obviously trying to reconnect, sort of restore those traditional ways of approaching the landscape and seeing the landscape, and the idea of the sort of permeability of land and water sort of disappearing, and wanting to reconnect with that. One of the things I'm looking at is Stones of Venice, um, and Ruskin's interest in traditional methods for essentially measuring the effects of changing water levels, and how when Venice was built, there was very much a consciousness of the fact that water goes up and down, and that fish pass through, and that there's like this sense that the landscape evolves throughout the year, and over time. I mean, he traces it to the Renaissance, but I think it becomes more significant a lot later than that. You sort of have this sense that everything has to be concrete, and that change is the direct result of sort of a loss, a lack of sort of traditional knowledge and understanding of wetlands, not only as a space, but as sort of like a cultural, an aspect of cultural identity. So yeah, so there's a lot to say about that, but yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Following up on both those excellent points, I think there's also the way kind of mainstream world approaches to the environment at the moment that center on capitalism, colonialism, and control. These have been sort of forced on wetlands around the world, and this is a huge reason we've lost so many wetlands. But wetlands really oppose that way of thinking about the world. They're so mysterious, they're so dynamic, they are always flowing and changing and trying to fight against all the infrastructures people put in place to try and contain them. And I think that in that way, wetlands really can provide a way of thinking with wetlands, I guess, that has kind of the wonder, the mystery, and the joy of nature that actually many people around the world, particularly in urban centres, have potentially lost. And similarly, the people who've maintained those cultural connections, wetlands do create these diverse and different cultures, and draining of wetlands is always very political. There's an example from southern Iraq where Saddam Hussein's regime was draining the marshes in order to marginalize the people. And I think that therefore the diversity and ways of seeing the world that co-evolve with wetlands can provide us with an alternative approaches to the biodiversity crisis. And so when we don't conserve wetlands and when we lose the ways of knowing associated with them, we really do lose the opportunity to approach a better future in a different way. So I think that losing wetlands is, yeah, once you start digging down, like the depths of how much more that creates as a loss for society worldwide is very concerning.
Brilliant, thank you. And today's World Wetlands Day theme is, well, actually, I suppose for Eden, it was yesterday's World Wetlands Day theme. But the theme is wetlands and traditional knowledge, celebrating cultural heritage. Final question for Phoebe and anybody else, if you guys would like to jump in as well. What about the species that don't have any cultural significance or historical sort of relevance? Do they get just lost in the conversation?
I think there's kind of two ways of looking at that. So in some cultures, there are species that don't have a particular role that aren't really thought about. And that's exciting because it means that we have the opportunity to create one by finding out more about these species. They can develop new kind of social and cultural roles. There's some like a lovely example from southern India of the purple frog, where conservationists connected this unknown species to other traditional stories, and it's now become a very popular frog. But I think also going back to the diversity of cultures, there are a lot of different cultures around the world, particularly indigenous peoples who value like the worldview is to value all species in a given environment that we share with, regardless of whether we even know if they're there or not, or whether they do have a prominent cultural role. And I think learning from this different way of viewing the world as seeing something as important, even if you don't necessarily know anything about it. I think that that kind of approach, more of a reciprocal interaction with nature, is something that those of us who aren't from those cultures can learn an awful lot from.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Great. So, well, Phoebe, Alex, Eden, thank you so much for presenting and spending a bit of time talking with us. It's been really fantastic to hear about the work that you're involved with and learn a bit more about the cultural and indigenous connections to wetlands. I was lucky enough to speak at quite a lot of length with Phoebe and Alex last year, trying to prepare for this report, Cultural Significance of Fishes report, that I wasn't able to get over the line last year, but Shoal will work on it this year. So keep an eye out in October. We're planning to publish this report. So Phoebe and Alex, I'm sure, and Eden as well, I'm sure I'll be messaging you, trying to pick your brains for some of this information. It's really, really interesting topic, and it's just such a broad topic that really fully intertwined with humanity all around the world since sort of the dawn of dawn of humans, really. It's a really huge topic. If anybody in the audience has any questions that weren't answered during this webinar, please email them over to info@shoalconservation.org and I'll forward them on to the relevant panelists and get back to you soon. I appreciate that it's Monday morning here in the UK and well before dawn in the Americas, so appreciate that many people wouldn't have been able to make this live session, but the webinar has been recorded, so people can point their friends in its direction if you think they'd be interested in watching. And people on the call now, feel free to share over social media with the panelists tagged and with Shoal tagged so that we can repost. If you haven't already, please do sign up for Shoal's monthly newsletter over at the website, which will keep you updated on news from the wider world of freshwater species conservation. Give us a follow on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. And the next webinar in this year's series will be sort of early to mid-March, soon after the publication of the New Species 2025 report, which will be on 3rd of March. And we'll speak with some of the adventurers and researchers and taxonomists who work so hard to discover and describe new freshwater fish species. There was a bumper crop of newly described freshwater fishes in 2025 with more than 300. So make a note in your calendar for that. Guys, thanks again so much for your time. That was really, really interesting. And I really, every time I speak to you about this topic, I really just feel like we've peeled back just one more layer of this sort of immense onion of information about fishes and cultural significance and sort of indigenous connections. So yeah, it's always a pleasure and a privilege to hear your thoughts and your insights on the topics. So yeah, thanks so much, and I hope to speak with you very soon.